do. So I'm going to put that plug in, because now that you're subscribed to Critters and Cultures, you also have to be subscribed to Culture Stew. It only makes sense. And then also right here to my left, I have beautiful Jasmin. She serves as the Director of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Initiatives for both the Association of Animal Welfare Advancement and MSM Global Consulting. She's a consultant, an educator, and equity thought partner who's helping reshape organizational culture and expands access to animal care. I am thrilled to have you guys both here.
It is an honor to be here. Thank you so
listen,
much.
did I give you, like, accolades aside, did I describe everything that you guys do, kind of sum it up a little bit?
Absolutely. I think so, yeah.
Okay,
yes.
all right. So tell me, what brings you guys into this work? I mean, the talk now is DEI or anti-DEI and DEI fatigue, and we're in like this political climate where DEI is not a word. Like, people are changing strategies for how they're partnering and changing strategies for not using the word DEI in fear of not getting funding and certain things. Tell me, what brings you guys into the work? What makes it personal for you?
I can start with kind of my journey in a sense. So a lot of my background was belonging in a space where existence as a Black woman. So I always center my identities, my intersectional identities as a Black woman. A lot of that was a contingent on how I could assimilate. And so for me, I always found some disconnect with that growing up. And then once I got to college, I found out there was opportunities to learn more about cultural understanding and identity. And from that, expose myself to different experiences, expose myself to different philosophies and understanding around how being different is a part of the process of humanity and having inclusion and community. And so that was kind of the starting point. I'm like, all right, there's something here that's happening, and I haven't been in spaces before to help explore that. And then I got to college, and through my engagement with organizations, my involvement outside with volunteer work, that led me to pursue a degree that helped me not only understand my experience and identity, but others. And so fast forward to now, getting in, I was in the higher education space for over a decade, doing a lot of diversity and inclusion work. And really the role in that time was helping students and faculty and staff figure out how to belong in spaces that historically have not been prepared for them. And so that is always a passion for me, like helping folks, helping them understand their origin story, and then figuring out ways for that to be included in their day-to-day, whether it was in their small communities, whether it was translated into the workplace. And so that led to me, starting my own consulting space and then pursuing things outside of higher education. And then one of our former colleagues actually connected us, and I've been doing diversity and inclusion work. And really my goal was not to get people to change. Right. It was really my goal to get you to think, like, how does your origin story, how do your experiences, how do these systems that exist within our society create spaces of exclusion and belonging, and how can we work together to remove more of that exclusionary activity,
and why it matters,
and
right?
bring in more belonging and inclusion in our authentic selves. We hear that term a lot,
right?
It's often said but not implemented in spaces, and so a lot of the work that I do helps people to build those connections. And so ended up connecting with Maria. We were doing some work with the association with building out leaders who can go into the animal welfare space and help to transform their organizational culture. And that just led to me, staying on with the team. And it's been a really great experience. Prior to that, I hadn't had any experience in the animal welfare space. And so being able to bridge my connection with organizational culture and just education in what is happening in the day-to-day, it doesn't really matter what industry, there's a need for us to build more inclusion and belonging. And so that's essentially kind of how I got here.
Listen, that is, I want to get to you, Maria, but I'm like, there's so much there that we can unpack, right? You're talking about DEI philosophies and sense of inclusion and building leaders to go out into the industry. And then like your pain points, right? Your own personal experience. And I'm also hearing, because I think this is similar for both of us, I definitely don't pretend to know all things about all cultures and all aspects of diversity because I'm a Black woman, right? So that was a really key point in saying, like, I also had to learn not just about my diversity, but about others and like how we can learn and build on that. So I love that. Maria, what about you? What is like your why? What brought you to the space? Like, and you too with the Culture Stew podcast.
What I love so much about hearing these origin stories is I think that unlike many other professions, it always starts with our our young memories, our early cultural memories, and so much of it is wrapped up in our identities, right? This is our life work. It's not just, oh, I chose this because it seems like an interesting profession to pursue, or certainly not because we think we're going to make a lot of money, you know. But for me too, it was part of my identity growing up. Looking as I do, identifying as a white woman, growing up in a very sort of middle class, white Christian community in the Midwest and Detroit, Michigan, and yet also having this very multicultural, multilingual upbringing. My father's side of the family were refugees twice over, and my mother, the family were non-native English speakers. So I just had this very eclectic upbringing, and like we, even though looking the way I do, we were the diversity on our block, which also tells you a lot about the self-segregation that existed in the suburbs of Detroit. And my parents were teachers in Detroit public schools, and so the vast majority of their students were Black and brown kids. And so I think from a very early age, I was exposed to a lot of different stories of cultural identity differences, but I also had this front row seat to the socioeconomic differences that existed, the stark racism that existed. And also, I think because of my parents' stories and my family's stories, there was a deep underlying message and core value around always be questioning and trying to understand what's under the surface, understand the multifaceted dimensions that make people who they are, be curious and compassionate, and be a voice for justice. And so that's just really been something that has driven me, I think, personally. And then similarly to Jasmin, just exploring that academically and professionally throughout my life, I think I've always been driven to support mission-oriented organizations. So the nonprofit sector, government sector has been something that has just been core to who I am as well.
I love it. You guys are like two powerhouses. It gets deep, but I like that we're tying it into our childhood, right? And the trauma that we've seen or that we've witnessed, right? Or experienced ourselves. And then that just makes us, it actually builds us up to be these voices for people that are not being heard, right? Everyone says voice to the voiceless, right? And just advocating in a different way because it's coming from our heart. It's not fake, which I think is one of the challenges with DEI, right? You guys talk a lot about DEI philosophies, new DEI philosophies. What does that mean?
So I can start with this one. I think that people reshape the same way of saying the same thing. So it does, to me, when I think about philosophies, that can be, am I thinking about it from a student development perspective? Am I thinking about it from a community center perspective? At its core, the philosophy that I really bring to the table is, one, what is your origin story? The other piece is, what do you need to be able to do this work for the long haul? So I think oftentimes when we do DEI work or diversity, equity, inclusion work, let's spell that out, right? People often focus on the other and they don't really recognize the internal work that has to happen on an ongoing basis.
Tell me what you mean by that. When they focus on the other, because you guys train leaders within organizations, right? And I'm sure that there's a lot of pushback and a lot of the things that need to happen in order to get people to essentially break, right? And see how they're going to be able to do this work effectively. So what do you mean by, for those that are listening, because they could be guilty of it, right? What does that mean when you see the others and not the work that needs to be done with you?
Okay, so when I think about the context of the animal welfare space, one of the things that I see recurring is this concept of saviorism, right? This idea that there's only one way of doing this work and there's only one way to essentially uplift and amplify communities and voices. And what often happens is that you have professionals going into environments or going into workspaces with a very limited worldview and norms that they have, and not recognizing that we've all been socialized in different ways because of experiences, because of education that really inform how we do things, and not recognizing that just because that is your way of doing it doesn't mean that that's everyone's way of doing it. And so I think for us, when we're trying to work with our leaders, is helping them to kind of get to the root of where that has come from. Where have you learned some of these messages or these assumptions about certain groups and how they treat their animals? And from that, figuring out, okay, how can we move forward to create more of a collective experience that is not just centering my viewpoint, but inclusive of other communities, right?
Right.
And I think that's very hard for folks, right? Especially in spaces where you have to, we just went to a session, we're talking about operating in a sense of urgency, right? It's something we have to do it fast, we have to do it quick, we have to do it now, and then that can lead to burnout. It can lead to us making rash decisions, right? That can have a significant impact on communities. And so we have to be at a point where we're not just really doing the work for the community, but we're also taking stock and doing our own work and recalibrating as needed, right?
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I'll stop there with that. But
yeah, no, I think it's a good point, and I'll have you add too. But there's terms for this, right? There's ethnocentrism, right? There's being more culturally relativistic. Just because my way isn't your way, it doesn't make it wrong.
Absolutely.
And I'm not asking you to change your viewpoint so that it fits mine. I'm just asking you to respect mine,
Absolutely.
acknowledge mine, and respect mine. What were you going to say, Maria?
Yeah, well, and building off of that, I think, all of us are on a continuum, on a journey, right? In terms of our own stages of development, exposure, understanding of all of these different identity dimensions, right? And so I might have exposure and understanding in some aspects, but not in others, just by nature of what I've been exposed to, what I've had access to, and what I haven't. What I've had societal advantages around, where I've been centered because of certain identities and where I haven't, right? And so I think to the extent that we can also look at some of these philosophies and recognize which ones kind of resonate with us more just because of our own core values and what matters most to us, and which ones might resonate more with others, how we can also kind of call folks in so that they see themselves reflected in it, right? Because I think about some of the philosophies that may resonate with me. For example, this idea of social justice and equity has, as I mentioned, has been a core part of my story since, the beginning. But that might not be the thing that gets other people really
going.
energized. Maybe it's more about the business case, about the bottom line. And that doesn't have to be an either or. Maybe they can be complementary. Or, for some, I often hear, and we've seen it in some of the assessment work that we've done with the association.
Assessments are important.
Yes.
People have to know where you stand. Organizations have to know where you stand, right?
Exactly. And to your point about ethno-relativism and ethnocentrism, a lot of times people kind of are in this kind of middle ground of, I don't see difference.
Yeah.
I don't see race.
So dangerous.
I don't see, it's dangerous.
So dangerous.
And I can also understand where people are because they're struggling with this desire for unity and oneness. And aren't we just one and the same? And yes, that is a limited viewpoint because oftentimes it's coming from a place of, it's easy to hold on to that when you're in a place of societal power and advantage. And I can see the desire for that philosophy. So can I tap into that desire, but also help people to see the value of acknowledging the differences?
Right.
So it's not an either or, but if we make people feel bad and guilty about wanting that and about valuing that unity and oneness, then I think we're doing people a disservice, because then we're telling them you're wrong and what you value is wrong, and we're losing a whole heck of a lot of people then.
Across the board, right? Yeah, no, I completely understand that. And I know there's struggles in your work, right? I know it's not easy work, and we talked about political climates already. Now, I will say, you mentioned that you have, I talk a lot about culture. So right? And one of the things that I like to mention about culture is a lot of times I think about it as an iceberg. You only see the surface, right? And you guys might have seen that before, right? The culture, the iceberg, is 90% is below the surface. Things that you cannot see about someone's identity and about their culture. You said you're facing, as a white woman doing this work. Is it easier to go into spaces and kind of quote unquote teach DEI and get the conversation in a time where people might not want to listen to me or Jasmin as Black women?
Yeah, I think that it's easier in some ways and harder in other ways,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
It's easier in some ways because I do think that there is a level of safety that certain folks feel because of the way I look.
Yeah.
And people will sometimes say the quiet parts out loud.
Right,
Because there's that
right.
just
Well, this is
automatic
why
sense of
you
affinity.
guys have to be a dual team,
Yeah,
right? Like, we're going to
exactly.
get them, boom, boom, right?
Exactly. And I think that coming from me, sometimes when I can call people in and say, one of the things that I'll often say is like, I once had a similar perspective, right? I can talk, and Jasmin and I
Yeah.
are very conscious and intentional about what we take the lead on when we're, when
Right,
we're
yeah.
having
It
conversations
matters.
around privilege and societal advantage and even talking about systemic racism. There are certain things that I will introduce as a white person,
Right.
because there is a level of, I think, kind of taking the temperature down
Yeah.
a little bit, the emotional temperature down.
I'm cracking up right
Yeah.
now. Yeah,
But it
it's
also,
real.
it's real.
Yeah.
And I also think that, again, that intentionality is important because I recognize that there are certain things that I say that are not going to, I'm going to have to work harder, or it's going to take longer for me to establish and build trust and credibility with people who have been historically marginalized, who are coming from racially
Right.
minoritized identities because of those racialized identities I carry. So
Right.
it's kind of two sides of the same coin, and I accept that.
Yeah.
I mean, that's a part of this work, is recognizing that, like, it's going to take a little bit of time, and that's part of it, right? So I don't know if you've got anything to add to that.
No, I don't. I mean,
Yeah.
I ditto to what Maria said. It's just, I think that this work is something that, one, you can't do in isolation. So that's the only thing I'll add. It's been amazing to be able to be on this journey within this space with someone who is constantly pushing the bar, pushing folks to think a little deeper around justice, and inviting folks to tell their stories, inviting folks to rethink, right, and reframe how they consider justice work or consider diversity, equity, inclusion, and also recognizing there's some folks who don't even recognize that they have even been on a journey, and so that is our role too, just as facilitators, just to get them to start that process. And so it's been a great opportunity, and then just being in this space, being connected with you and other folks. Shout out to the BIPOC Collective.
We see you.
Right, we see you, we love you, right? But I think that community piece is important in spaces,
very
especially that could historically not been representative of the multiple ways that people love on their animals. So
yeah. So I will say, for those listeners, just to hold space for the BIPOC and Animal Welfare Collective, you can Google, you can find the BIPOC Collective on LinkedIn and socials, but it is a space where Black and Indigenous people of color in animal welfare can join and just be in community doing some of the work that we're talking about here, supporting each other in a industry that is predominantly white. So I think that's really, really a good call out. And thank you so much, Maria, for your call out as well. And I was going to share a story. We could go on and on and on, but I was going to share a story because as a veterinarian, as a Black veterinarian, I'm also in spaces that are predominantly white. And there's one doctor, him and I work together most of the time. I'm not going to call his name right now, but he will sometimes leave rooms with Black clients waiting for me to get in for my shift. And I always struggled with whether or not that was appropriate. And I think we're going to leave that for another episode because we don't have a lot of time. Okay, in closing, I would say one shift. You talked about shifts. If there was one shift, in short, that you guys would both like to see with your work in the DEI space, what would that one shift be? What would you want organizations or people, what shift would be most important to you?
The revolution will not be televised. Get off of media, reconnect with people, right? I think at its core, we have to give six. So that would be my hope, prayer, wish, is that we take more time to be in connection and community with people. Social media has ruined that. Technology has ruined that, in my opinion. And there's a lot to learn from stories. And I don't think that necessarily translates all the time through media. And so that would be the shift that I would like.
Okay, back to the basics. I like it.
And building off of that, more willingness to embrace courageous conversations and sitting down and being willing to disagree, sometimes vehemently, but to do it with a willingness to listen, to be curious, to share those stories, not with the intention to necessarily change people's, deeply held beliefs or vantage points necessarily overnight, but to just humanize one another, to see one another, to build connections, and maybe just expose ourselves a little bit to different ways of being and thinking. I think we've seen it. It's so powerful. It's possible, and we all need to be doing more of it.
Yeah. Well, thank you both so much for being on this mini series. It has been a beautiful conversation with two wonderful, beautiful powerhouses. I feel like all of my Critters and Cultures guests become my besties. So I have two new besties here doing good work. I appreciate you guys jumping on the live. Doing lives are not easy, but we're excited to have had this conversation with you both. And you guys can hang out for a little bit. I'm going to get our next guest on in just a minute. We'll keep the recording going. Actually, we'll probably discontinue. I'm going to end this recording so that the next recording is a fresh one. But thank you guys so much. Please see the show notes for any information and how to reach these two wonderful people. And thanks for joining us on the Critters and Cultures podcast.